Welcome back, everyone, to Track Facts. I'm Nick Kling. With me today is former trainer and jockey Jeff Carl. Our friend and regular host Tom Amello is on assignment today, so Jeff has graciously agreed to come in and sit with me so I don't make a complete fool out of myself. But right now we're going to talk to someone who rarely does that. Daily Racing Form publisher Stephen Crist, sometimes called the King of the Pick Six, and he's here to talk about a promotion next Saturday with Capital OTB about the Breeders' Cup and the Ultra Pick Six. Steve, good morning. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning, Nick. Thank you.
First thing I got to ask you about, Steve, before we get into the Breeders' Cup or horse racing is how are your greyhounds doing?
They're doing just great. Thanks very much for asking. In fact, yesterday was their birthday. They turned 9. They're littermates and brothers, so happy birthday to them.
Well, my wife's favorite part of your Daily Racing Form blog is the pictures you put into the greyhounds, so I hope you'll have some more coming soon.
Well, now that I know that, I'll redouble my efforts.
Steve, let's talk a little bit about the upcoming Breeders' Cup and the Pick Six. That's a subject of its own, but the Breeders' Cup will be run on the Pro Ride synthetic surface for the first time. There are many people, as I'm sure you know, that have expressed, some fear about betting races on synthetic surfaces. How do you plan to approach the Breeders' Cup this year?
Well, I guess to use a word I'd say I'll approach it warily. The races that are going to be run on Pro Ride, I mean, several of them have favorites who have already proven that they can handle that surface. But, we've seen over the years that weird things can happen in the Breeders' Cup in general, just when you put together full fields of, top-class horses. The Pro Ride just adds a new wild card. I mean, if some really good horses who haven't tried it before, just run abysmally, I'm not going to be shocked, and I look at it as kind of a randomizing factor.
How do you view it, Steve? And one thing that's probably been true about several of the Breeders' Cups that have been held is that they've been run over racetracks that might have had some kind of an inherent bias of its own. It's been run at Belmont Park a few times, known, for the occasional deep rail. It might have been that way, a few years ago when the Breeders' Cup was held at Belmont. There's always going to be a benefit or a detriment to some horses, no matter where races are held or a Breeders' Cup is held. Do you think at the end of the day on Saturday, are you betting that it will come away and saying, well, this really wasn't that much different than some other years, or do you think there will be some results that are just confounding?
I think more the latter. I don't really think of synthetic tracks as just another kind of biased or quirky track. They are a brand new surface. I think it was premature to hold a Breeders' Cup over one at all, personally. They're something that may well be gone from racing in 10 years. I think that's just as likely as that they're going to be ubiquitous in 10 years. I think we're in very early days with these surfaces. People are very ambivalent about them. And the claims that have been made on their behalf in terms of safety, I think are very shaky at best. So, we're in a transition time, and I think it's very early for us to be deciding our championships on one of these things.
The last two times the Breeders' Cup has been held at Santa Anita, in 1993 and 2003, it seemed like there was a noticeable benefit to the locally based horses. Richard Mandela did extremely well both times. Some of the other California-based horses, and not favorites either, did very, very well. Do you expect to see that again this year?
Yeah, I mean, there is a built-in, home court or home region advantage. Look, last year in the slump at Monmouth, Eastern horses coming from Belmont Park dominated the thing as heavily as Californians have ever dominated one held out there. Practically every horse who won a final prep race at Belmont, just went down to Monmouth and did the same thing. So, there's always, a kind of bias going on, and the synthetic tracks really add a new wild card, with obviously the focal point being Curlin. I don't think anyone doubts that Curlin is by far the best horse in the Breeders' Cup Classic. He's the best dirt horse in the world. I'm honestly not going to be shocked to see him first or eighth in the Breeders' Cup Classic.
Steve, I think my partner Jeff has got a question for you. Jeff?
Hi.
Hey, Jeff.
Good morning, Steve. I couldn't agree with you more on your take on the synthetic tracks. Being a horseman and a rider, I've have experience training over the synthetic tracks out at Stonebridge Farm, and I agree with you completely that I don't think at this point in time we should be running championship races, championships being decided on synthetic tracks. But taking that into consideration, when you look at the Classic, we've got a couple of European horses coming over. What's your feeling on them? I mean, because obviously Curlin's better than any of the American horses that are in the race, and the only thing that's going to beat him in that aspect might be the synthetic track. How do you feel the Europeans are going to do in the Classic?
Well, I really don't know, and I think people may be oversimplifying things to say, well, grass horses do well on synthetic surfaces, so the Europeans are going to do well. I think the correlation between synthetic surfaces and grass racing was initially very true at Keeneland with the polytrack that they had there, which was a slow surface and a tiring surface and an anti-speed surface, and therefore grass horses who tend to run slower early and faster late seem to do well over it. But there's really no particular indication that on these harder, faster synthetic surfaces in California, that grass horses are moving up. No, old-fashioned super speed, early speed from California, those kind of horses aren't wiring fields and winning races the way that they used to. But I wouldn't assume that every European horse is going to run well on pro ride. I mean, the races are still going to be run like American races, and it's a very quirky hit-or-miss proposition whether European grass horses take to it. In the same way, it's a hit-or-miss proposition, whether our dirt horses can run well on grass. I mean, we saw Curlin and Big Brown this year, run pretty well on grass, but I don't think they're the same kind of dominant horses on grass that they were on dirt.
Steve, even without Big Brown in the Classic, the race itself, could offer some very intriguing storylines. Jeff mentioned you've got the three Group 1 winners from Europe. You've got Curlin, who we don't know how he'll handle the pro ride. We've got the synthetic specialists, so to speak, like Go-Between and some of the other California horses. And then we have the imponderable factor of Casino Drive. How do you assess any or all of those elements of the race?
Well, it makes it a very difficult and a very wide open race. Casino Drive is a great storyline. My gut feeling, though, is that he's going to be a terrible, terrible underlay. Mm-hmm. Talented and promising as he is, to ask this horse to beat Curlin and all these good Europeans and some synthetic specialists, in what's going to be his fourth career start, his first start ever against top-class horses, I'm expecting him to be in the 6-7 to 1 range, and to me he's 20 to 1 to win the race. So he's a horse I'm kind of looking to go the other way and to play against.
One of the biggest controversies of the Breeders' Cup, Steve, was whether Zenyatta should have been pre-entered in the Classic rather than the Distaff / Ladies Classic. Where do you come down on that?
I never expected her to be entered against the boys. That's just not the kind of thing that her connections do. And I don't really think that they should have. This is a filly who hasn't won a championship of any kind yet. It's one thing with a mare like Azeri, who had already won the Breeders' Cup Distaff, who had already won a couple of Eclipse Awards, and you say in her final career start, okay, let's, shoot for the moon and try against the boys. But I think Zenyatta needs to win the Distaff, or Ladies Classic, as they now insist on calling it.